One more disruption, and we'll have you deplaned? The flight attendant threatened, leaving 6-year-old Maya in tears. The attendant Heather saw a black family she could easily intimidate. She was oblivious to the fact that 8-year-old Jaden had spent years in his father's law office filling a justice journal with FAA regulations. As Heather stood smugly with the violation forms, she had no idea the quiet boy was about to stand up. He wouldn't just defend his family. He would dismantle her authority with a legal genius that would leave the entire flight speechless. The Washington family had been planning this trip for months. Derek Washington, a respected corporate lawyer specializing in discrimination cases, and his wife Ayanna, a brilliant pediatrician, were heading to Los Angeles with their 2 children. Ayanna was scheduled to speak at a prestigious medical conference, while Derek planned to use the opportunity to show their children another part of the country. 8-year-old Jaden Washington wasn't like most boys his age. While his classmates collected baseball cards and video games, Jaden collected facts particularly about laws and regulations. His father often joked that Jaden had been born with a gavel in his hand instead of a rattle. "Knowledge is your superpower, son," Derek would tell him during their evening sessions in his home office. In a world that might not always treat you fairly because of the color of your skin, knowing your rights is your best defense. Jaden took these lessons to heart, memorizing legal codes and regulations with the same enthusiasm other kids showed for song lyrics or sports statistics. He kept a small notebook that he called his Justice Journal, filled with carefully printed notes about civil rights laws, regulations, and precedent-setting cases his father had explained to him. 6-year-old Maya was different from her brother, but equally remarkable. Where Jaden was analytical and precise, Maya was artistic and empathetic. She could sense tension before anyone spoke a word, and her drawings captured emotions with startling accuracy for someone so young. The morning of their flight, the Washington family buzzed with excitement in their Atlanta home. Suitcases stood by the front door. Passports and tickets were checked multiple times, and Mia's special comfort blanket was securely packed in her backpack. "Remember what we talked about?" Derek said quietly to Jaden as they loaded the car. "Travel can sometimes bring challenges for families like ours." Jaden nodded solemnly. He understood what his father meant without needing elaboration. At only 8 years old, he had already experienced enough subtle and not so subtle discrimination to recognize the patterns. "I've got my notebook, Dad," he patted his backpack, "and I've been studying the airline passenger rights section." Derek smiled, though there was a sadness behind his eyes that Jaden recognized. It was the same look his father got whenever he had to prepare his children for the unfair realities of the world. Their arrival at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was smooth until they reached security. Despite the family's status, Derek in his tailored suit, Ayanna in her professional attire, and the children neatly dressed, they were pulled aside for random additional screening. "Why do they need to check inside my teddy bear?" Maya whispered to her mother as a TSA agent examined her stuffed animal with unusual thoroughness. "It's just procedure, sweetheart," Ayanna answered. But she exchanged a knowing glance with Derek. Jaden watched everything, his observant eyes noting how the white family ahead of them had passed through with only smiles and casual conversation, their bags barely glanced at. He remembered his father's words about different rules for different people and made a mental note in his justice journal. When they finally reached their gate, another incident occurred. The gate agent checking boarding passes frowned when the Washingtons presented their first-class tickets. "These are first-class boarding passes," she said, her tone suggesting there must be some mistake. "Yes, they are," Ayanna replied calmly. "The medical conference is covering our travel expenses." The gate agent looked from the passes to the family and back again, her disbelief poorly concealed. "I'll need to verify these," she said, picking up her phone. While they waited, Maya tugged on Jaden's sleeve. "Why is she checking our tickets again?" "She didn't check anyone else's extra." Jaden squeezed his sister's hand. "Remember what Dad says about being twice as good?" Maya nodded, her eyes wide. "To get half as much." "We'll be okay," Jaden assured her, though he could already sense this flight might test the lessons his father had been teaching him. After several minutes of needless verification, the gate agent reluctantly returned their boarding passes. "You're cleared to board," she said, without the smile she had offered previous passengers. As they walked down the jetway, Derrick placed a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "You're doing great, son. Just remember, observe record and only engage when necessary." Jaden nodded, his mind already cataloguing every interaction, building a case file just like his father had taught him. Little did he know how soon those skills would be put to the ultimate test. The Washington family made their way down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737 boarding passes in hand, searching for their assigned seats in the first-class cabin. Jaden noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere as they entered the premium section. Conversations dimmed and heads turned. He'd felt this before, the weight of unexpected presence, of being viewed as out of place. 12. A through D, Derrick announced, cheerfully trying to maintain a positive atmosphere for his children. "Looks like we're right here." Flight attendant Heather Miller, a blonde woman in her mid-40s with a pinched expression, did a double take as the family settled into their plush leather seats. Her practiced smile faltered momentarily before she recovered. "I think there might be some confusion," she said in a tone that was friendly on the surface but laced with condescension. "These are first-class accommodations." "Yes, we're aware," Ayanna replied with the calm assurance of someone who had navigated similar situations before. "The medical conference I'm speaking at arranged our travel." Heather's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded and moved on without another word. Jaden, always observant, noticed she didn't offer the customary welcome she had extended to the previous first-class passengers. In the row across from them, a middle-aged white couple whispered to each other while glancing repeatedly at the Washington family. The man, who would later introduce himself loudly to other passengers as Bradley Cooper, no relation to the actor, unfortunately leaned toward his wife. "Looks like they're letting anyone up here these days," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. His wife, Karen Donovan, a woman with an elaborate blonde hairdo and excessive jewelry, nodded in agreement. Standards certainly aren't what they used to be. Maya, sensitive to tension, pressed closer to her mother. "Mommy, why are those people looking at us funny? They're probably just tired from waiting to board." "Sweetheart." Ayanna, deflected though the tightness around her eyes, told a different story. As the boarding process continued, Heather moved through the first-class cabin, offering pre-flight beverages, sparkling water, orange juice, champagne. She offered to each passenger with practiced efficiency. Yet when she reached the Washington family's row, she breezed past without a word. After serving everyone else in first class, Heather began helping with the boarding process at the front of the plane. Derrick raised his hand politely to catch her attention. "Excuse me, I believe you missed our row for the pre-flight beverages," he said, his tone professional and courteous. Heather glanced at him with barely concealed annoyance. "We're quite busy with boarding right now. I'll have to circle back if there's time." "Of course," Derrick replied with a tight smile, then turned to his children with a wink. "Good thing we brought our own water bottles, right, guys?" Jaden wasn't fooled by his father's light tone. He recognized the strategy. Maintain dignity, avoid confrontation, document the disparity. He pulled out his notebook and jotted down the interaction, complete with time and specific details. In his mind, he recalled the conversation he'd had with his father just last week. "Dad, why do we have to be so careful all the time?" he had asked after an incident at a restaurant where they'd been seated by the kitchen, despite numerous empty tables with better views. Derrick had considered his son thoughtfully before answering. "Jaden, there's a game being played whether we choose to participate or not. The rules aren't fair, but knowledge gives us power. When you know your rights and can speak about them calmly and precisely, you change the game." Back on the plane, Jaden watched as his father quietly took out his phone and made a few notes. They were both documenting in their own ways, father and son creating a record of what others might dismiss as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. As the final passengers boarded, the atmosphere in first class grew increasingly uncomfortable. A white businessman requested to change his seat after discovering he would be sitting next to Derrick. The flight attendant accommodated him immediately despite the nearly full flight. Maya opened her coloring book, trying to distract herself from the tension. Her small fingers worked carefully as she selected a blue crayon for the sky in her picture. Karen Donovan, seated across the aisle, sighed loudly. Must we be subjected to children's activities? I paid for a peaceful flight, she said to no one in particular, though her gaze was fixed on Maya. Ayana gently placed her hand over Mars. You're doing great, sweetie. That's a beautiful sky you're creating. Jaden felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, the indignation that came with watching his family be treated unfairly. But he remembered his father's lessons about choosing the right moment to respond. He took a deep breath and continued his observations, waiting and watching as the pattern of differential treatment became increasingly clear. The plane finished boarding and the doors closed. As they prepared for takeoff, Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would test everything his father had taught him about standing up for himself and his family. He just didn't know how soon that test would come. The seatbelt sign dinged off as Flight 237 reached its cruising altitude. The gentle hum of the engines provided a backdrop to the increasingly tense atmosphere in the first-class cabin. Jaden observed as Heather and another flight attendant began their service routine, distributing hot towels and taking drink orders from the first-class passengers. Bradley Cooper received his scotch on the rocks with a warm smile from Heather. Karen Donovan's gin and tonic came with a little extra lime, just as she had requested. Rowby Rowe, the flight attendants, moved through the cabin with efficient courtesy until they reached the Washington family. Water. Heather said flatly, not making eye contact, as she placed 4 plastic cups on their tray tables. No ice, no lemon, and noticeably smaller cups than those provided to other passengers. Actually, I ordered tomato juice, Derek pointed out politely. Heather's lips tightened. We must be running low on that. Water is what's available for now. Jaden noticed that immediately after leaving their row, Heather served tomato juice to an elderly white man across the aisle. Ayana and Derek exchanged glances but said nothing, choosing not to escalate the situation. Jaden, however, made another entry in his notebook recording the disparity in service with the precision of a much older person. The meal service followed a similar pattern. While other passengers received multiple options for their in-flight meal, the Washington family was told that only one choice remained by the time the cart reached their row. The portions seemed smaller, the presentation less careful. "Mommy, why does everyone else's food look better than ours?" Maya whispered, her young eyes missing nothing. "Sometimes things just work out that way," sweetheart Ayana replied, though the tension in her voice was evident to Jaden. Bradley Cooper, who had been watching the interactions with poorly concealed interest, suddenly reclined his seat all the way back, slamming into Jaden's space without warning. The tray table jolted, spilling some of Jaden's water onto his pants. "Sir," Derek said, leaning forward, "would you mind giving a bit of warning before reclining? My son's drink just spilled." Cooper turned his expression unapologetic. "These seats are designed to recline. If your boy can't handle his drink, that's hardly my problem." Derek took a deep breath, clearly weighing his response. Before he could speak, Heather appeared at their row again. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, though her gaze was directed at the Washington family rather than at Cooper. Mr. Cooper reclined his seat suddenly, causing my son's drink to spill, Ayana explained calmly. "We were just asking for a little courtesy." Heather's expression remained unmoved. "The seats do recline fully in first class. That's one of the premium features." Her emphasis on premium carried an unmistakable subtext. "We're well aware of the features," Derek replied, his voice level but firm. "Common courtesy is typically included as well." Heather's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps if you're uncomfortable with the standard features of first class, you might find the main cabin more suitable for your needs." Jaden watched his father's jaw tighten, the slight flare of his nostrils that indicated he was controlling his anger. Derek Washington had built his legal career on maintaining composure in the face of provocation, and he was modeling that skill for his children. "Now we're quite comfortable with our assigned seating." "Thank you," he said evenly. Perhaps you could bring a napkin for my son." Heather nodded curtly and walked away, returning moments later with a single cocktail napkin, which she dropped on Jaden's tray table without a word. Meanwhile, Maya had been quietly coloring in her book, trying to stay within the lines despite the occasional turbulence. Her concentration was total, her small tongue sticking out slightly at the corner of her mouth as she worked. "Excuse me?" Karen Donovan's sharp voice cut through the cabin noise. "That child's activity is disrupting my flight experience." Heather was at her side immediately. "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Donovan?" "The constant movement and noise from that coloring activity is giving me a headache," Karen complained. Though Maya had been working silently, and still I paid for a premium experience not to be seated near a children's playroom. Instead of recognizing the absurdity of the complaint, Heather turned to Ayana. "Ma'am, please control your child's activities. They're disturbing other passengers." Ayana's professional demeanor showed the first cracks of frustration. "My daughter is quietly coloring in her book. She's not making any noise or disruption." Nevertheless, Heather insisted, "If another passenger is uncomfortable, we need to address the situation. Perhaps your daughter could take a nap instead." Maya's lower lip trembled as she slowly closed her coloring book. Jaden felt his heart breaking for his sister and a surge of protective anger rise within him. The flight continued in this manner, with each interaction marked by subtle or overt discrimination. When Maya Shilley asked for apple juice, Heather informed them that they were out only for Jaden to observe her serving apple juice to a white child several rows ahead. Just minutes later, Derek had been discreetly recording some of these interactions on his phone, careful to avoid filming other passengers. Captain Samuel Thomas's voice came over the intercom, reminding all passengers to comply with crew instructions for a safe and pleasant flight experience. The emphasis on compliance wasn't lost on Jaden, who noted it in his journal alongside the growing list of desperate treatment. As the tension in the cabin continued to build, Jaden caught his father's eye. Derek gave him a slight nod, acknowledging their shared understanding of what was happening. It was a look that said, "We see it, we know, we're documenting it." But Jaden could also see the weariness behind his father's composed exterior, the exhaustion that came from constantly navigating these waters, from having to prepare his children for a world that would often judge them before knowing them. What neither of them knew was that the situation was about to reach a breaking point, and that Jaden's carefully compiled knowledge would soon be put to a test far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The flight had been underway for nearly 2 hours, the tension in the first-class cabin simmering like a pot ready to boil over. Maya sat quietly next to her mother, her coloring book closed on her lap after Karen Donovan's complaints. The little girl's usual brightness had dimmed her shoulders, hunched slightly as if trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. "Mommy," Mia whispered, leaning close to Ayana's ear. "I need to get my stuffed giraffe from my backpack." "My tummy feels funny." Ayana nodded understandingly. Maya's funny tummy was often her way of expressing anxiety, and her stuffed giraffe spots was her comfort object in stressful situations. "Of course, sweetheart, your backpack is under the seat in front of you." Maya unbuckled her seatbelt and slid forward, reaching down to pull her small pink backpack from beneath the seat. As she struggled to unzip the overstead bag, her arm bumped her water cup, which had been precariously balanced on the edge of her tray table. The cup tipped, sending water splashing across the aisle. Most of the water landed on the airplane carpet, but a few drops spattered onto Karen Donovan's designer shoes. "Oh my God!" Karen shrieked, jerking her feet up as if the water were acid. "Look what she's done. These are Louboutins." Maya froze her eyes, widening in horror. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but her small voice was drowned out by Karen's continued outcry. "This is exactly what happens when you let these people into first class," Karen announced loudly, looking around for support from other passengers. "No home training whatsoever. In my day, children knew how to behave in public, especially certain children." The racial undertone in her comment was unmistakable. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others nodded in agreement. Heather appeared, instantly rushing to Karen's side with a stack of napkins. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Donovan. Let me help you with that. These shoes cost more than their tickets." Karen continued, gesturing dismissively toward the Washington family. Who's going to pay for this damage? Maya's lower lip trembled, tears welling in her eyes. She looked up at her mother, devastation written across her young face. Ayanna was already on her feet, napkins in hand. I apologize for the accident. Let me help clean up. Don't touch my shoes. Karen snapped, snatching the napkins from Heather. Just keep your child under control. Heather turned to Ayanna, her expression stern. Ma'am, you need to control your children. This kind of disruptive behavior can't be tolerated. It was an accident, Derek interjected, his voice calm but firm. My daughter was simply trying to reach her backpack. The water barely touched Mrs. Donovan's shoes. Nevertheless, Heather replied, this is becoming a pattern of disruption from your family. First the coloring, now this. She lowered her voice slightly, but not enough to prevent others from hearing. I'm going to have to report this incident to the captain. If there are any further issues, we may need to consider deplaning your family at our next scheduled stop. Maya, hearing this, began to cry in earnest, silent tears streaming down her face. She pressed herself against her mother's side, trying to disappear from the judgmental gazes surrounding them. The injustice of the situation hit Jaden like a physical blow. His sister, just 6 years old, being shamed and threatened for an accident that any child, any adult even could have had. He watched as Maya's small shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, how she tried to make herself invisible, and something inside him shifted. This was the moment his father had prepared him for, though neither of them could have predicted it would come so soon or in such circumstances. Have you ever witnessed a child being unfairly blamed for something minor? Comment number 1 if you believe Maya was treated unfairly by the flight attendant and Karen. Hit that like button if you've ever had to stand up for someone you love when no one else would. And subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage in the face of injustice. What would you do if you saw your little sister being treated this way? Would you stay quiet, or would you find the courage to speak up? Let's see what young Jaden decides to do as our story continues. While Maya's tears fell silently beside him, Jaden's mind raced through a catalogue of memories, searching for the tools his father had given him for exactly this kind of situation. He recalled a pivotal day last summer, a memory that now seemed like preparation for this very moment. It had been a rainy Saturday afternoon. Most kids his age would have been playing video games or watching TV, but Jaden had wandered into his father's home office, drawn by the towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes. Derek Washington had been surprised to find his 7-year-old son flipping through a hefty tome on civil rights law. Heavy reading for summer vacation, Derek had commented, sitting down beside Jaden. I like the way the words sound. Jaden had replied, plaintiff jurisdiction precedent. He pronounced each word carefully, savoring their importance. This one says, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in programs receiving federal financial assistance. Derek had stared at his son in amazement. You understand what that means? Jaden had nodded seriously. It means people can't treat us differently because we're black if they get money from the government. He paused thoughtfully. Do airlines get money from the government, Dad? That question had launched months of evening sessions between father and son. What had started as a child's curiosity had evolved into something more purposeful. Derek, recognizing his son's unusual aptitude, had begun teaching Jaden about specific regulations that might one day protect him in a world that wouldn't always treat him fairly. Knowledge isn't just power, son. Derek had explained one evening as they reviewed airline passenger rights. It's armor. It's a shield when the world tries to make you feel small. Jaden had taken those words to heart, creating what he called his Justice Notebook, a small black composition book filled with carefully printed regulations, laws, and precedents organized by category. Airline regulations occupied several pages, updated regularly as Derek shared new information from his legal practice. The memory dissolved as Heather's voice cut through Jaden's thoughts, bringing him back to the tense airplane cabin. I'll be informing the captain about this latest incident, she was saying to his parents. One more disruption, and we'll have no choice but to take further action. Jaden glanced at his sister, still trembling beside their mother, then at his father, whose calm exterior couldn't completely mask the frustration in his eyes. This was the moment all those evenings in the Home Office had been preparing him for. Carefully, he reached down and pulled his justice notebook from his backpack. He flipped to the tabbed section labeled Airlines, quickly scanning the neatly printed entries until he found what he was looking for. Then, making sure no one was watching, he pulled out his father's spare phone, the one Derek had given him for emergencies only. With swift, practiced movements, Jaden typed a message to his father's colleague, Anthony Jackson, a civil rights attorney who specialized in transportation discrimination cases. Jaden had met Anthony several times at family gatherings and had always been impressed by the attorney's booming laugh and no-nonsense approach to injustice. Mr. Anthony, he typed on flight with discriminatory treatment. Need confirmation on FAA Reg A 121.317 and CFR Title 14 protections. Emergency. Jaden W. While waiting for a response, Jaden thought back to another incident 6 months ago when he'd first put his legal knowledge to practical use. His third-grade teacher, Mrs. Hartman, had consistently graded his papers more harshly than those of his white classmates. After collecting evidence for weeks, Jaden had calmly presented his case to the principal, complete with side-by-side comparisons of his work versus others with identical answers but different grades. According to the school district's Equal Educational Opportunity Policy Section 4.3, he had stated with the seriousness of a practiced attorney assessment, practices must be fair and equitable for all students, regardless of race, color, or national origin. The principal's jaw had dropped. Not just at the evidence, but at hearing such precise policy citation from an 8-year-old. Mrs. Hartman had been required to attend bias training, and Jaden's grades had been retroactively corrected. Derek had been immensely proud, though also saddened that his son had needed to use these skills so young. "You handled that perfectly," he told Jaden. "But remember, choose your battles carefully. Save your strongest arguments for when they matter most." The phone in Jaden's hand vibrated with an incoming text. Anthony had responded. Jaden FAA Reg A 121.317 prohibits air carriers from subjecting person to discrimination on flights. Title 14, CFR Part 91 covers passenger rights. Document everything. Airline's own code of conduct likely prohibits discriminatory treatment by staff. Specific airline. We'll send more. Stay calm. AJ Jaden quickly replied with the airline name, then tucked the phone away as Heather walked past their row again, eyeing the Washington family with poorly concealed disdain. On his lap, Jaden's justice notebook lay open. He reviewed the regulations Anthony had confirmed, plus several others he had documented. He mentally rehearsed what he might need to say, organizing his thoughts into clear, logical points, just as his father had taught him. Beside him, Ma's crying had subsided to occasional hiccups. She clutched her stuffed giraffe, which Ayanna had retrieved from her backpack. The plush toy's neck was damp with tears as Mia held it close to her face. "It's okay, Maya," Jaden whispered to his sister. "I'm not going to let them treat you like this." Ayanna overheard and gave Jaden a warning look. "Sweetheart, let Daddy and me handle this situation," she said quietly. But Jaden could see the mounting tension in his parents' expressions. His father was documenting everything discreetly on his phone, and his mother was trying to comfort Maya while maintaining her dignity in the face of blatant discrimination. They were handling it the way adults often did, with patience restraint and strategic documentation for later action. Jaden, however, was beginning to think that later might be too late, especially as he saw Heather returning with Frank Davis, the head flight attendant. Their expressions and body language suggested they weren't coming to offer an apology. The phone in his pocket vibrated again. Another text from Anthony. Airline's own published customer commitment. Section 3. All customers will be treated fairly and consistently in the provision of all services. Section 7. We do not discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or age. Recent case against them settled for $750,000 for similar incident. Go get MC, little man. AJ Jaden took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm settle over him. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about Maya, whose first major experience with discrimination was happening at 30,000 FT with nowhere to escape. It was about his parents who shouldn't have to fight these battles every single day. It was about doing what was right, using the knowledge his father had armed him with. As Frank Davis approached with security forms in hand and Heather trailing behind with a triumphant look, Jaden closed his notebook and straightened his shoulders. Everything his father had taught him had led to this moment, and he was ready. Frank Davis moved through the first-class cabin with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Tall and imposing in his crisp uniform, he carried a clipboard with official-looking forms, his expression suggesting the matter was already decided. Behind him, Heather Miller maintained a professional demeanor, though Jaden didn't miss the slight curl of satisfaction at the corner of her mouth. Karen Donovan watched from her seat, arms crossed and eyes narrowed in vindication. Maya clutched her stuffed giraffe tighter, pressing herself against Ayana's side. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear as she registered the seriousness of the approaching flight attendants. Mr. and Mrs. Washington Frank began his tone formal and cold. "I've been informed of multiple disruptions from your family during this flight, culminating in damage to another passenger's property." "That's not accurate." Derek began, his voice measured, despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. "There was a minor accidental water spill, that barely." Frank held up his hand, cutting Derek off mid-sentence. "Sir, I've already received reports from both my flight attendant and other passengers. I'm not here to debate the incidents." He held out the clipboard. "These are passenger conduct violation forms. I'll need you to sign them, acknowledging that any further disruptions will result in your family being removed from the flight at our next stop in Denver and potentially being added to our no-fly list." Ayana's intake of breath was sharp. No-fly list for a child accidentally spilling water. "The forms detail multiple violations," Frank replied without emotion. "Disruptive behavior failure to comply with crew instructions, creating unsanitary conditions, and verbal confrontation with crew members." "None of that is true," Derek said, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "And I can assure you, I will not be signing anything that falsely characterizes my family's behavior." Frank's expression hardened. "Then I'm afraid I'll have to inform the captain that you're refusing to comply with crew instructions, which is itself a federal violation." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Other passengers watched with uncomfortable fascination, some filming discreetly with their phones, others pretending to be absorbed in their books or screens. It was at this precise moment that Jaden Washington stood up. At 8 years old, he wasn't physically imposing. His Spider-Man t-shirt and neatly pressed khakis didn't suggest authority, but there was something in his posture, a certainty, a confidence beyond his years that caused everyone to pause. "Excuse me, Mr. Davis," Jaden said, his voice clear and steady despite his racing heart. "Before you proceed with those forms, I think you should be aware of several regulations and policies that are being violated on this flight." Frank blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting to be addressed by a child, much less in such a formal manner. "Young man, this is a matter between the airline and your parents." Actually, Jaden continued, unfazed. According to the FAA's own regulations, specifically 14 CFR Section 121, 317 air carriers are prohibited from subjecting any person in air transportation to discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or ancestry. The cabin fell utterly silent. Even the ambient noise of the plane's engine seemed to fade as passengers and crew alike tried to process what they were hearing. Furthermore, Jaden continued, his voice gaining strength. "Your airline's own published customer commitment. Section 3 states that all customers will be treated fairly and consistently in the provision of all services. And Section 7 explicitly prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or age." Frank's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Heather's smug expression had been replaced by one of shock. "My sister," Jaden said, gesturing to Maya, who was watching her brother with wide-eyed wonder, accidentally spilled a few drops of water. Yet she's been threatened with removal from the flight, while I personally witnessed a white passenger in row 2 spill an entire glass of wine earlier without so much as a reprimand. He turned slightly to address Karen Donovan directly. And regarding Mrs. Donovan's Louboutin shoes, which she's so concerned about, Consumer Product Safety Commission guidelines classify water as a non-damaging substance to treated leather, making her claim of property damage legally unsupportable. Karen's face flushed crimson. "How dare you, I'm not finished," Jaden said with a politeness that somehow made his interruption even more powerful. "Since boarding this flight, my family has experienced differential treatment in violation of multiple federal regulations. We were denied pre-flight beverages that were offered to every other passenger. My sister was told there was no apple juice available, only to watch it being served to another child 10 minutes later. We were provided with smaller cups, lesser meal options, and subjected to hostile service. All of these incidents have been documented and will be included in the formal complaint we'll be filing with the Department of Transportation, the FAA's Office of Civil Rights, and if necessary, federal court." Jaden reached into his backpack and pulled out his justice notebook, flipping it open to a specific page. Additionally, I should note that in Henderson versus North Central Airlines, the court held that differential treatment in air carrier services constitutes a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act when a pattern of discrimination can be established. We have documented no fewer than 14 separate incidents on this flight alone. Frank Davis stood frozen clipboard, hanging limply at his side. The authoritative demeanor had vanished, replaced by uncertainty and growing alarm. "I would also like to remind you," Jaden added his voice somehow, both childlike and authoritative at once, "that your airline settled a similar discrimination case just last year for $750 on dollars. I imagine your corporate office would be very interested in avoiding a repeat of that situation, especially given the number of passengers currently recording this interaction on their phones." As if on cue, several passengers lowered phones they had been holding up, confirming Jaden's observation. "Now," Jaden said, taking a deep breath, "I believe you have two options, Mr. Davis. You can continue with this discriminatory treatment and face the legal consequences, or you can acknowledge the inappropriate behavior, ensure equal treatment for the remainder of our flight, and we can all return to enjoying our journey to Los Angeles." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank Davis looked from Jaden to Derek, clearly trying to process what had just happened. Derek's expression was a complex mixture of pride, awe, and the sad recognition that his son had been forced to grow up too quickly. Finally, Frank cleared his throat. "I'll need to discuss this with the captain." He managed tucking the clipboard under his arm. "We'll be here," Jaden replied with a polite smile, sitting back down next to his sister. As Frank and Heather retreated toward the front of the plane, the first-class cabin erupted in a mixture of reactions. Some passengers were openly applauding. Others looked uncomfortable or confused. Karen Donovan was furiously texting on her phone, her face still flushed with anger and embarrassment. Maya looked up at her brother with eyes full of wonder. "Jay," she whispered, "how did you know all that stuff?" Jaden smiled and tapped his notebook. "Dad always says knowledge is our superpower, remember? I just used mine when we needed it." Ayanna wrapped her arm around Jaden's shoulders, pulling him close. "That was incredible, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But you shouldn't have had to do that, not at 8 years old." "It's okay, Mom," Jaden replied, wisdom beyond his years in his eyes. "Dad taught me that sometimes you have to stand up even when it's scary." Derek reached across to squeeze his son's hand, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. In that moment, he was experiencing the bittersweet reality of Black parenthood in America. Immense pride in his son's courage and brilliance, alongside the heartbreak that such skills were necessary so young. What no one in the Washington family could have anticipated was how quickly Jaden's stand would reverberate beyond the confines of Flight 237, or how many lives would be changed by what had just transpired at 30,000 FT above the American heartland. For several long moments after Jaden resumed his seat, the first-class cabin remained in a state of suspended animation. Frank Davis stood frozen at the front of the cabin clipboard, clutched to his chest, his expression caught between disbelief and dawning horror as the professional and legal implications of the situation began to sink in. The spell broke when a distinguished older gentleman in seat 3A slowly began to applaud. He was soon joined by a young woman in business attire, then by a middle-aged couple, until most of the cabin was filled with the sound of appreciation and support. "That's the most remarkable thing I've ever seen on a flight," the older gentleman announced, rising slightly from his seat to address Jaden directly. "Young man, you are extraordinary." The man introduced himself as Thomas Reynolds, a senior partner at a major law firm. "I've been practicing law for 40 years, and I couldn't have presented that case any better myself," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Everything you cited was absolutely correct." By the way, Heather Miller's face had drained of all color. She whispered urgently to Frank, who nodded and disappeared into the cockpit, presumably to brief the captain on the situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. Across the aisle, Karen Donovan's earlier confidence had evaporated. She was frantically dabbing at her perfectly dry shoes with a napkin, perhaps trying to create evidence of damage that didn't exist. Her husband, Bradley Cooper, had sunk low in his seat, suddenly fascinated by the safety card in the seat back pocket. Meanwhile, the modern phenomenon of viral content creation was in full swing throughout the cabin. At least a dozen passengers had their phones out, some openly filming, others typing rapidly on social media apps. The Noi legal 8-year-old was already beginning to trend. I just posted the video to my account. A young woman in row 5 announced to no one in particular. 20,000 followers, and it's already being shared like crazy. Another passenger, a man in his 30s wearing a tech company hoodie, leaned across the aisle toward the Washington family. I tagged the airline's corporate account in my post. Their social media team is definitely going to see this. Maya looked around in confusion at the sudden shift in the cabin's atmosphere. "Are we in trouble?" she whispered to Jaden, still clutching her stuffed giraffe. "No, Maya," Jaden replied with a reassuring smile. "I think we're going to be okay now." The cockpit door opened and Captain Samuel Thomas emerged. Unlike Frank, whose authority had been largely in his uniform and demeanor, Captain Thomas carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his 4 stripes. He surveyed the cabin briefly before approaching the Washington family. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington." He began, his deep voice calm and measured. "I'd like to apologize for the situation that has developed on our flight today. It appears there has been some miscommunication and inappropriate handling of several incidents." Derek nodded, maintaining his composure. "We appreciate your acknowledgement, Captain. I've received a rather unusual call from our corporate office." The captain continued, a hint of bewilderment in his tone. "Apparently, videos of what transpired here are already circulating online. The airline CEO has personally requested that I address the situation immediately." Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "That was quick." "Social media works faster than legal briefs," Thomas Reynolds commented from across the aisle. "I'm sure their PR team is in full crisis mode right now." Captain Thomas cleared his throat. "Mr. Davis will be returning with proper refreshments for your family momentarily. Ms. Miller has been reassigned to cabin service in the main cabin for the remainder of the flight." As if on cue, Frank appeared with a tray containing 4 fluts of sparkling apple cider premium snack boxes and warm towels. His earlier condescension had been replaced by careful professionalism. Compliments of the airline, he said, distributing the items with exaggerated care. "Again, we sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding." Maya's eyes widened at the sight of the fancy drinks with actual cherries as garnish. "Look, Mommy, they're pretty." The transformation in service was as immediate as it was transparent, but the Washington family accepted it with grace. Jaden, however, wasn't quite finished. "Mr. Davis," he said politely as the flight attendant turned to leave, "I believe Mrs. Donovan was planning to move to another seat since she expressed concern about sitting near children." Frank glanced toward Karen, who was now pretending to be asleep despite the commotion around her. "I'll arrange that immediately," he agreed. Within minutes, Karen had been relocated to the last row of first class, as far from the Washington family as possible. Bradley Cooper, perhaps sensing the shift in cabin dynamics, had suddenly become deeply engrossed in his magazine, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The remaining hours of the flight passed in a remarkably different atmosphere. The service became impeccable, with multiple flight attendants checking on the Washington family's comfort. Other passengers stopped by to introduce themselves and expressed their admiration for Jaden's poise and knowledge. A woman who identified herself as a television producer discreetly handed Ayana her business card. "When you're ready to tell this story, I'd love to help," she whispered. "What your son did today needs to be shared." Throughout it all, Jaden maintained a humble demeanor, thanking people for their kind words, but seeming more concerned with ensuring Maya was enjoying her apple juice and snacks. For all his extraordinary knowledge and composure, he was still an 8-year-old boy who just wanted to protect his little sister. As the plane began its initial descent into Los Angeles, Captain Thomas made an announcement that caused a ripple of surprise through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that there will be representatives from the airline's executive team meeting our flight at the gate. They've asked to personally address certain events that occurred during our journey today. We appreciate your patience during deplaning as they speak with the affected passengers." Derek and Ayana exchanged meaningful glances. This had escalated far beyond what either of them had anticipated when they'd boarded in Atlanta. "Dad," Jaden said quietly, "did I get us in trouble?" Derek shook his head, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "No, Jaden. You stood up for what was right exactly the way I taught you. I couldn't be prouder." "But I interrupted you." Jaden persisted, a flicker of worry crossing his face. "You were trying to handle it the adult way." "Sometimes," Ayana interjected, "the adult way isn't always the right way. What you did took courage and intelligence that most grown-ups don't have." From the seat behind them, Thomas Reynolds leaned forward. "Your parents are right, young man. I've spent decades in courtrooms fighting these battles the adult way, as your mother puts it. But what you did today, speaking truth to power with such clarity and precision, that's something special." As the plane touched down at LAX and taxied toward the gate, Jaden noticed something unusual through the window. Beyond the typical ground crew, a group of people in business attire stood waiting on the jetway, their expressions serious and attentive. "Look at all those important people," Maya said, pressing her nose against the window. "Are they here because of what happened?" "I think they might be," Jaden replied, suddenly feeling the weight of attention that awaited them. What the Washington family didn't yet realize was that beyond the airline executives on the jetway, a small group of journalists had gathered in the terminal, alerted by the social media storm that had erupted mid-flight. The story of an 8-year-old legal prodigy standing up against discrimination at 30,000 FT was already capturing the national imagination, spreading far beyond the confines of Flight 237. As the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began to gather their belongings, Jaden closed his justice notebook and carefully returned it to his backpack. Whatever happened next, he had used his knowledge when it mattered most, just as his father had taught him. For now, that was enough. The Washington family remained seated as other passengers deplaned, following the flight attendant's polite but firm request that they wait to speak with the airline representatives. Maya, who had recovered her spirits after the dramatic turn of events, was contentedly drawing in her sketchbook, creating what appeared to be a courtroom scene, with a small figure in a judge's robe that bore a striking resemblance to Jaden. "That's you being a judge," she explained when she caught her brother looking. "Because you know all the rules." Jaden smiled, though his stomach fluttered with nervous energy. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in. He had stood up to adults in positions of authority, cited federal regulations and legal precedents, and effectively changed the course of events on the flight. It was empowering, but also overwhelming for an 8-year-old, regardless of his exceptional knowledge. "You doing okay, champ?" Derek asked quietly, noting his son's pensive expression. Jaden nodded, "Just thinking about what happens next." "Whatever it is, we face it as a family," Ayana assured him, adjusting his collar affectionately. "You've already handled the hardest part." As the last regular passengers exited, three individuals in crisp business attire entered the cabin. The woman in front, a tall African-American executive with short silver hair and penetrating eyes, introduced herself as Victoria Harrington, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience. Mr. and Mrs. Washington, she began her tone professional but warm. First, let me extend our deepest apologies for what you and your children experienced today. What happened on this flight falls far short of our standards and values as an airline. Derek nodded acknowledgement but remained reserved. As a lawyer, he knew better than to accept apologies that might later be construed as settling a potential legal matter. Victoria turned her attention to Jaden. And you must be the young legal scholar I've been hearing about. Your understanding of aviation regulations and passenger rights is truly remarkable. Jaden straightened in his seat. Thank you, ma'am. My dad says, knowledge is the best defense against injustice. Victoria's expression softened. Your father is a wise man. She glanced at Derek with professional respect before continuing. The airline would like to make this right, though we understand that some experiences can't simply be compensated away. What happened today reflects systemic issues that require meaningful action. She proceeded to outline immediate steps the airline was taking. Heather Miller had been suspended pending a full investigation. All crew members would undergo enhanced amphibious training, and the airline was reviewing its complaint response procedures. Additionally, Victoria continued, we'd like to offer your family full refunds for today's flight first-class upgrades for your return journey and vouchers for future travel. More importantly, we'd like to invite Jaden to participate in our Corporate Inclusion Advisory Panel. His perspective would be invaluable as we work to ensure this never happens again. Maya, who had been listening with half an ear while colouring, suddenly perked up. Does that mean Jaden gets to tell all the airplane people what to do? The tension broke as everyone chuckled at her innocent interpretation. Something like that. Victoria smiled. Your brother has shown us that sometimes it takes a child's clarity to see where adults have gone wrong. As they discussed logistics, Frank Davis approached hesitantly, looking markedly different from the authoritative figure who had confronted them earlier. His captain's stripes seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. Now owe your family an apology, he said, addressing primarily Derek and Ayana, but glancing at Jaden as well. I failed in my duty to ensure all passengers were treated with dignity and respect. There's no excuse for what happened. What might have been a perfunctor corporate apology carried surprising sincerity. Frank explained that he had a nephew Jaden's age, and the incident had forced him to consider how he would feel if his own family member had been treated similarly. It's easy to hide behind procedures and protocols, he admitted. What your son did today was remind us all that behind those protocols are real people with real feelings and real rights. As Frank stepped away, Thomas Reynolds, the lawyer who had supported Jaden earlier, approached to say goodbye. I've left my card with your parents, he told Jaden. When you're ready for law school, and I suspect that might be sooner than most, give me a call. My firm would be honored to support your education. By the time the Washington family finally exited the aircraft, they were surprised to find a small crowd gathered at the gate. Word of what had happened had spread throughout the terminal, and several passengers from the flight had shared their videos and accounts with waiting journalists. There, someone called out as Jaden emerged, causing a flurry of camera flashes and extended microphones. Jaden, how did you learn so much about airline regulations? Called out a reporter from a local news station. Can you tell us what it felt like to stand up to discrimination? Asked another. Ayana stepped protectively in front of her children. I'm sorry, but my son is just 8 years old. This has been a long and emotional day for our family. We won't be making any statements right now. Victoria Harrington's team quickly intervened, escorting the Washington family through a side entrance to a private lounge where they could compose themselves away from the media frenzy. I didn't know people would care so much, Jaden said, looking bewildered by the attention. What you did resonates with a lot of people, sweetheart, Ayana explained. Many families have experienced what we did today, but didn't have the tools or courage to speak up. Derek nodded in agreement. You gave voice to something many people feel, but can't express. That's powerful. As they waited for their luggage to be delivered to the lounge, Derek's phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. Anthony Jackson, the civil rights attorney Jaden had texted from the plane, had been trying to reach them for hours. Derek Anoni's message read, "Your son's stand is going viral. I've had calls from 3 major networks and the Southern Poverty Law Center. When you're ready to talk strategy, call me." This could be a watershed moment for addressing discrimination in air travel. More messages followed from colleagues, friends, and even a few of Derek's former law professors who had somehow already heard about Jaden's remarkable stand for justice. Meanwhile, Maya had discovered a television in the corner of the lounge which was tuned to a local news channel. Her eyes widened as she recognized her own family in the bureau footage being shown. "Mommy, Daddy, look, we're on TV," she exclaimed, pointing excitedly at the screen. Sure enough, the afternoon news was running a segment titled 8-Year-Old Legal Eagle Stands Up to Airline Discrimination. The footage, clearly taken from a passenger's phone, showed Jaden standing in the aisle confidently citing regulations to a stunned flight crew. In breaking news, a remarkable story of courage at 30,000 toss at FT. The news anchor was saying, "An 8-year-old boy is being hailed as a hero after standing up to what witnesses describe as blatant racial discrimination on Flight 237 from Atlanta to Los Angeles." The Washington family watched in stunned silence as their private experience was broadcast to millions. The report included interviews with several passengers, including Thomas Reynolds, who spoke eloquently about witnessing one of the most inspiring acts of civil rights advocacy I've seen in 40 years of legal practice. The reality of what was happening began to sink in. This wasn't just about one incident on one flight anymore. Jaden's stand had struck a chord that was reverberating far beyond what any of them could have anticipated. Victoria Harrington, who had stepped out to take a call, returned with a grave expression. "The airline CEO would like to speak with you personally," she informed them. "This situation is being taken at the highest levels of seriousness. Also, I should inform you that the videos from the flight have collectively been viewed over 2 million times in the past 3 hours." Derek and Ayanna exchanged looks of amazement and concern. Their family vacation had suddenly become something much bigger, something that might affect airline policies and practices for years to come. Amidst the whirlwind of attention and corporate damage control, Jaden remained remarkably centered. When a moment of quiet finally came, he turned to his father with a question that cut to the heart of everything. "Dad," he asked thoughtfully, "did I change anything today? Really change it, I mean, or will people just forget and go back to the way things were?" Derek considered his son's question with the seriousness it deserved. Change isn't usually a single moment, Jaden. It's a process. What you did today was create a moment of clarity that might be the beginning of that process for a lot of people. He pulled his son close in a hug. And that's how real change happens, one brave stand at a time. 1 week after flight, 237 landed in Los Angeles. Jaden Washington sat on a plush sofa in the green room of Good Morning America, attempting to stay still while a makeup artist made minor touch-ups to his face. Despite the early hour, he was wide awake, mentally reviewing the talking points his parents had practiced with him. "Just be yourself," Ayanna reminded him, straightening his bow tie for the 3rd time. "You don't have to use legal terms or cite regulations. Just speak from your heart." Derek, reviewing the pre-approved questions on his tablet, nodded in agreement. "They want to hear your story, son, not test your knowledge of FAA regulations. The past 7 days have been a whirlwind that none of the Washingtons could have anticipated." The videos of Jaden's stand against discrimination had collectively garnered over 50 million views across various platforms. A Justice Jaden and married young legal eagle 8-year-old had trended nationally for 3 consecutive days. Their family had received messages of support from people across the country and around the world. More significantly, the airline had announced comprehensive changes to its training and complaint procedures. Heather Miller had been terminated following an internal investigation that revealed previous complaints about her treatment of minority passengers. Several executives, including the Vice President of In-Flight Services, had resigned or been reassigned? You're on in 5 minutes, Jaden, a production assistant announced, poking her head into the green room. Maya, who had been colouring contentedly in the corner, looked up from her artwork. Can I come too? I drew pictures for the TV people. Not this time, sweetheart, Ayana explained gently. But we can watch Jaden on the monitor right here, and your pictures are going to be in his book. The book had been another unexpected development. A major publishing house had approached the family about creating a children's guide to knowing and asserting your rights with Jaden as the author and Maya as the illustrator. The advance had already been committed to a college fund for both children. Jaden was escorted onto the brightly lit set where he was greeted warmly by the hosts. Despite the millions watching at home, he appeared remarkably composed as he settled into the interview chair. Jaden, what you did on that flight has inspired people across the country. The female host began. Where did you find the courage to stand up like that? Jaden considered the question carefully before answering. My dad always says that knowledge is a superpower. When you know your rights, you can stand up for yourself and others. I was just using the superpower he gave me. The simplicity and sincerity of his answer visibly moved the hosts. The male anchor leaned forward. And how did it feel in that moment when you stood up to address the flight attendants? I was scared, Jaden admitted his honesty, disarming. My heart was beating really fast, but I was more scared about what would happen if I didn't say anything. My sister was crying, and that made me brave. The interview continued for several minutes with Jaden thoughtfully addressing questions about discrimination, courage, and what other children might learn from his experience. When asked about his future plans, he smiled. I want to be a civil rights lawyer like my dad and help people who don't know how to help themselves yet, and maybe be a judge someday, because judges make sure the rules are fair for everyone. Back in Atlanta, the impact of Jaden's stand continued to ripple outward. His school had invited Derek to help develop a Know Your Rights curriculum for students of all ages. The local bar association had reached out about creating a mentorship program for minority youth interested in legal careers. More personally, Jaden had begun receiving letters and emails from children across the country who have been inspired by his example. A 10-year-old girl in Detroit had successfully challenged her school's discriminatory dress code. A group of middle schoolers in Houston had used Jaden's approach to address unfair disciplinary practices that disproportionately affected students of color. Each letter was carefully answered with Jaden and his parents working together to provide encouragement and resources to these young advocates. The airline, meanwhile, had made good on its promises. Beyond the personnel changes and new training programs, they had invited Jaden to speak to their executive leadership team about his experience. What might have been a token gesture turned into a 3-hour session where Jaden's clear-eyed perspective on how discrimination feels to a child led to tearful revelations and renewed commitments to change. Victoria Harrington, who had been promoted to Executive Vice President of Customer Experience and Inclusion, remained in regular contact with the Washington family. Under her leadership, the airline had established a scholarship program for minority students interested in aviation careers, with Jaden serving as an honorary board member. The most significant change, however, came 6 months after the incident, when the Department of Transportation announced new guidelines for airlines regarding discrimination complaints, explicitly citing the Flight 237 incident as a catalyst for regulatory review. On a personal level, the experience had transformed the Washington family in subtle but important ways. Derek had reduced his corporate caseload to focus more on civil rights work, finding renewed purpose in addressing systemic discrimination. Ayana had begun incorporating cultural competency training into her pediatric practice, helping other healthcare providers better serve diverse patient populations. Maya, though still too young to fully understand the implications of what had happened, had nonetheless absorbed important lessons about courage and speaking up. Her drawings had evolved to include themes of justice and fairness, often featuring her brother as a superhero with a briefcase instead of a cape. As for Jaden himself, he remained remarkably grounded despite the attention his actions had attracted. He still collected facts and regulations in his justice notebook, still approached the world with curiosity and precision. But there was a new confidence in his bearing, a certainty that knowledge applied with courage could indeed change the world. A year to the day after Flight 237, the Washington family boarded another plane, this time heading to Washington, D.C., where Jaden had been invited to speak at a national conference on civil rights education. As they settled into their first-class seats, the airline had provided lifetime status upgrades. Jaden noticed a young black girl across the aisle, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, watching him with wide, curious eyes. Her mother leaned over and whispered something in her ear, and the little girl's face lit up with recognition. Shyly, she held up a book for him to see. It was Know Your Rights with Justice Jaden, his recently published children's guide to standing up against discrimination. Jaden smiled and reached into his backpack, pulling out his well-worn justice notebook. He carefully tore out a blank page, wrote a message of encouragement, and passed it to the little girl. "What did you write?" Maya asked, as the girl clutched the paper to her chest with delight. "I told her that she has superpowers too," Jaden replied. "She just has to learn how to use them." As the plane taxied toward the runway, Jaden gazed out the window at the vast expanse of sky. What had begun as a frightening confrontation on a flight had evolved into something far more significant. A movement of young people discovering their voices and their power to effect change. Knowledge was indeed a superpower, Jaden reflected, but he had learned that courage was its essential companion. One without the other was incomplete. Together, they could transform not just a single flight, but perhaps in small but meaningful ways, the world itself. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's courage changed a situation for the better, or perhaps you've been that brave person yourself? Share your stories in the comments below. And if Jaden's story inspired you today, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that they have the power to make a difference. Remember, it's not about age or size. It's about knowing what's right and finding the courage to stand up for it. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story, and we'll see you in the next one. Jaden's powerful stand against discrimination teaches us that knowledge truly is a superpower when coupled with courage. In a world where injustice often goes unchallenged, understanding your rights provides the foundation to speak truth to power. What makes this story remarkable isn't just that an 8-year-old boy stood up against discrimination, but that he did so with precision, composure, and undeniable facts. The Washington family's experience highlights how racism persists in everyday interactions, forcing many families of color to prepare their children for discrimination at devastatingly young ages. Yet within this difficult reality lies an important message of hope. Prejudice may be deeply rooted, but it's not invincible when faced with prepared minds and brave hearts. Jaden's impact rippled far beyond Flight 237, creating institutional change and inspiring others to find their voices. His story reminds us that meaningful change rarely happens in grand, sweeping gestures, but through individual acts of courage that inspire others to action. Perhaps most importantly, Jaden teaches us that no one is too young, too small, or too powerless to make a difference. By arming himself with knowledge and finding the bravery to use it when it mattered most, one child changed policies, shifted perspectives, and started a movement. This is how transformation begins, one brave stand at a time. Has there been a moment in your life when you witnessed discrimination and wished you'd known how to respond? Or perhaps you've been the brave one who spoke up when others remained silent. Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to find their voice. If Jaden's courage moved you today, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that they have the power to stand up against injustice, no matter their age or circumstances. Thank you for joining us in celebrating the courage of a remarkable young boy who reminds us all that knowledge, when paired with bravery, can truly change the world. Until next time, remember your voice matters.